In November of 2025, a woman living somewhere in the state of Florida received the kind of news that no amount of preparation could soften. Not a diagnosis, not a death in the family. Something altogether different, something that reached into the very foundation of who she believed herself to be and pulled it apart. She was told that her name was not her name, that the identity she had carried for as long as she could remember, the name on her driver's license, the name her 3 children called her, the name her friends and neighbors had known for years, was an alias, a fabrication, a mask placed over her real identity when she was far too young to resist it or even understand what was being done to her. Her real name, she learned, was Michelle Marie Newton. She had been born in Kentucky, and 42 years earlier, when she was just 3 years old, she had been taken from her lawful guardians by her own mother, a woman named Deborah Lee Curry Newton, and hidden in plain sight for more than 4 decades. In that same state of Florida, Deborah was placed under arrest. The charge was custodial interference. The crime had been committed in the spring of 1983. The consequences had taken 42 years to arrive. This is the story of Michelle Marie Newton, a child who was stolen not by a stranger lurking in the shadows, but by the one person a child trusts above all others. This is the story of a family in Kentucky that never stopped searching, of a woman in Florida who never knew she was lost, and of the moment when the truth finally reached across 4 decades of silence to find them both. To understand how it happened, we need to go back to Louisville, back to 1983, back to the day everything changed. Michelle Marie Newton came into the world around 1980 in the state of Kentucky. What is known about her earliest years is defined almost entirely by what happened next. Her disappearance at the age of 3 consumed the narrative of her life so completely that the ordinary details of her infancy were eclipsed by the extraordinary circumstances that followed. What the records tell us is this: by the early months of 1983, Michelle's parents were no longer together. The specifics of their separation are not detailed in publicly available records, but the legal outcome was clear. Custody of Michelle did not rest with her mother. Deborah Lee Curry Newton was designated the non-custodial parent. Michelle was in the care of other family members, searching relatives, as they would later be described, who had been granted lawful guardianship through the courts. That single legal distinction, non-custodial, is the fulcrum on which this entire story turns. In family law, custody orders are not suggestions. They are judicial determinations, made after review of evidence and testimony, that define where a child will live and who will be responsible for her safety and welfare. When a non-custodial parent violates that order by removing the child from the jurisdiction and concealing her whereabouts, what follows is not a domestic dispute. It is a crime. It is classified as family abduction, and it carries the full weight of criminal prosecution. Louisville, Kentucky, in the early 1980s was a city rooted in its neighborhoods. Communities were tightly knit, built around churches, schools, and family ties that had held for generations. The Ohio River traced the northern boundary of the city, and life moved at a rhythm that balanced the energy of a growing urban center with the familiarity of a place where people knew each other's names and looked after each other's children. Michelle was 3 years old within this world. Old enough to walk and run, old enough to laugh and play and recognize the faces of the people who cared for her. Old enough to respond to her name when someone called it, but far too young to understand what a custody order meant, far too young to know that a legal battle was being waged over her future, and far too young to remember any of it when it was all taken from her. In the spring of 1983, Michelle's life in Louisville was about to end, not because of an accident or an illness, but because her mother made a decision a calculated, deliberate decision that would echo across the next 42 years and reshape the lives of everyone it touched. On April 2, 1983, Michelle Marie Newton disappeared from Louisville, Kentucky. She was 3 years old. The person who took her was her mother, Deborah Lee Curry Newton. The act was classified by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children as a family abduction. The available records do not describe the precise mechanics of how Deborah obtained access to Michelle that day, whether it was during a scheduled visitation, an unauthorized pickup, or some other circumstance that brought mother and daughter together. What is documented is the outcome. Deborah took Michelle and did not return her. There was no note, no forwarding address, no phone call to the custodial family explaining where they were going or when they would be back. One day, Michelle was in Louisville. The next, she was gone. Deborah had simply vanished, and she had taken her 3-year-old daughter with her. For a toddler, the transition would have been seamless in the cruelest possible way. Children at that age do not question why they are in a car. They do not wonder why the scenery outside the window has changed, or why the house they sleep in looks different from the one they remember. They orient themselves around the adult holding their hand, and for Michelle, that adult was her mother. Wherever Deborah went, Michelle went, and wherever they ended up, that became Michelle's new reality, accepted without question because she had no framework to question it. At some point after leaving Louisville, Deborah established a new identity for Michelle. The Charley Project notes that when Michelle was eventually located more than 4 decades later, she was going by an alias name. The implication is stark and deliberate. Deborah did not merely take Michelle to a new city and continue raising her under her birth name. She gave her daughter a new name entirely. She erased the identity of Michelle Marie Newton and replaced it with a fabrication, a name that Michelle would carry through childhood, through her teenage years, through adulthood, and through motherhood without ever knowing it was not her own. The deliberateness of that act cannot be overstated. Changing a child's name is not an impulsive gesture. It requires creating new documentation, building a new narrative, and maintaining that narrative consistently across years and decades. It means answering questions. It means keeping a story straight. It means that every single time Michelle introduced herself to a new friend, enrolled in a new school, applied for a new job, or filled out a government form, she was using a name that did not belong to her, and she had absolutely no idea. Back in Louisville, Michelle's absence was reported immediately. The family members who had been entrusted with her care, the searching relatives, as the case file would later describe them, contacted law enforcement the moment it became clear that Deborah had taken Michelle and was not bringing her back. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office opened a missing persons case. Because the disappearance involved a young child taken by a non-custodial parent in violation of a court order, the case was also referred to the Kentucky Crimes Against Children Unit, a specialized division within the state's law enforcement infrastructure equipped to handle cases involving crimes against minors. An alert was issued. Deborah Lee Curry Newton was identified as the abductor. The basic facts of the case were documented and entered into the system. 3-year-old white female, taken by her non-custodial mother from Louisville, Kentucky. Date of disappearance, April 2, 1983. Those facts entered the records, and then began the longest chapter of this story, the waiting. The investigation into Michelle's disappearance was defined from the beginning by a bitter irony. Investigators knew exactly who had taken the child. There was no mystery about the perpetrator. Deborah Lee Curry Newton was identified immediately and without ambiguity. But in cases of family abduction, knowing who took the child and knowing where that person went are two entirely different problems. And in 1983, the tools available to bridge that gap were far more limited than they are today. The early 1980s were a different era for missing children investigations. There was no internet. There were no digital databases linking law enforcement agencies across state lines in real time. There was no social media to scan, no online public records to search, no facial recognition software to deploy. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the organization that would eventually become the nation's most critical clearinghouse for missing children's cases, did not even exist yet. NCMEC was established in 1984, a full year after Michelle disappeared. Before its creation, there was no centralized national-level system for coordinating the search for missing children across jurisdictions. For the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office and the Kentucky Crimes Against Children Unit, the early stages of the investigation would have relied on the tools of the time, contacting Deborah's known associates and family members in other states, checking whether she had surfaced in any law enforcement database, and monitoring for any activity under her name. But a non-custodial parent who was determined to disappear in 1983 holds a formidable set of advantages. She has legal identification. She has a social security number for the child. She knows the child's medical history. She can enroll the child in school, visit doctors, open bank accounts, and rent apartments. All of the ordinary machinery of daily life, under a new name in a new state, and none of it will automatically trigger an alert. The passage of time compounded the difficulty. As months turned into years and years turned into decades, Michelle's case settled into the category that no family and no investigator ever wants to see: a long-term missing person. The file remained open. The case was never closed. But the active leads, if there had been any in the early months, appeared to have dried up. Deborah had accomplished what she set out to do. She had disappeared with her daughter, and she had stayed disappeared. And yet, the case was never forgotten. As new databases and organizations came into existence, Michelle's information was entered into each of them. NCMEC once established, Haas took on her case and maintained it in their active files for decades. The Charley Project, a comprehensive public database of missing persons cases maintained by dedicated researchers, cataloged Michelle's information with the same meticulous care it brings to every case: her full name, her date and location of disappearance, her physical description, the name of her abductor, and the contact information for the investigating agencies. Perhaps the most remarkable artifact of the ongoing investigation was the age progression image. Around 2021, nearly 4 decades after Michelle's disappearance, NCMEC commissioned a forensic age progression photograph that attempted to depict what Michelle might look like at approximately age 42. The image was created by forensic artists using Michelle's childhood photographs and accounting for genetic factors, aging patterns, and the physical changes that occur between early childhood and middle age. The existence of that age progression said something important. It said that nearly 40 years after a 3-year-old girl vanished from Louisville, Kentucky, someone was still looking. The case was still active. The child, now a grown woman somewhere in America, had not been forgotten. Her photograph was still being updated, her file still maintained, her name still circulated in the hope that someone, somewhere, would recognize her. The contrast between the two images that accompanied Michelle's case file, a toddler photographed around 1983 with round cheeks and innocent eyes, beside the digitally rendered face of a 42-year-old woman carrying the same bone structure but an entire unaccounted-for lifetime in her expression, captured the heartbreak of this case in a single visual. 40 years, compressed into 2 photographs placed side by side, and still, for years, no definitive breakthrough came. Deborah had done what successful family abductors do. She had disappeared so completely that even the expanding reach of modern investigative tools could not immediately find her. She had maintained her concealment across the analog era, through the dawn of the Internet, through the rise of social media, through every technological advancement that should have made hiding harder. But the net was always tightening, slowly, incrementally, inevitably. The years between 1983 and 2025 represent a silence that is almost impossible to comprehend in its scope. 42 years. That is not a gap in a case file. It is an entire lifetime lived in parallel, one family searching, one woman unknowingly hiding, and the truth suspended somewhere in between, waiting to be discovered. For Michelle's searching relatives back in Kentucky, the passage of time carried its own particular and unrelenting kind of grief. Family abduction occupies a uniquely painful space in the spectrum of human loss. The child is not dead, or at least there is no reason to believe she is. She is alive somewhere, breathing, growing, learning, laughing, becoming a person. But she is doing all of those things beyond the reach of the people who love her most, in a place they cannot find, under a name they do not know. Every birthday that passed was a birthday without Michelle. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every first day of school, every graduation season carried an absence that never got easier to bear. The family could only imagine the milestones they were missing: the lost teeth, the school plays, the first dates, the driver's license. They did not know where Michelle was living, what name she was using, whether she was happy, or whether she ever sensed that something about her life was not quite what it seemed. Meanwhile, in Florida, Michelle was building a life she had every reason to believe was entirely her own. She grew from a toddler into a child, from a child into a teenager, from a teenager into a young woman. She formed friendships, she built a career, she fell in love. At some point, she became a mother herself, 3 times over. She had 3 children who knew her by her alias, who called her by a name that was not the one she had been given at birth. She was, by every outward measure, living an ordinary and complete life. And that is the deepest wound of family abduction, the wound that separates it from almost every other kind of crime. It is not just the loss of a child from a family. It is the construction of a false reality so thorough, so total, so seamlessly woven into the fabric of everyday life that the victim herself cannot see through it. Michelle did not know she was missing. She did not know she was somebody else. She did not know that hundreds of miles away, people who shared her blood were carrying the weight of her absence every single day. The cage she lived in had no walls, no locks, it had no bars. Its only material was a lie told so early and so consistently that it became indistinguishable from the truth. All the while, the case file in the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office waited. The NCMEC entry remained active. The age progression image, updated in 2021, continued to circulate. The echo of Michelle's disappearance persisted across the decades, quiet, patient, unwavering. In November of 2025, the silence broke. Authorities located both Deborah Lee Curry Newton and Michelle in the state of Florida. After 42 years of searching, 4 decades of waiting, and an entire lifetime lived under an assumed identity, the case of Michelle Marie Newton was resolved. The specific investigative steps that led to the breakthrough are not fully detailed in the publicly available reporting. The Village's News, a Florida-based publication, was among the outlets that covered the resolution of the case and is cited as a source by the Charley Project. What is known is that the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office and the Kentucky Crimes Against Children Unit, the same agencies that had opened the investigation in 1983, were involved in bringing it to a close. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which had maintained Michelle's active case file for decades and generated her age progression image, played an essential role in keeping the case visible and the search alive long enough for the breakthrough to occur. What investigators found when they reached Michelle was not a child in distress or a prisoner in need of rescue. They found a grown woman, approximately 45 years old, a mother of 3 children, living under an assumed name in a community where she was known and established. Michelle had spent her entire conscious life as someone else. Every memory she possessed, every relationship she had built, every piece of identification she carried, every form she had ever signed bore a name that was not the one she had been given at birth. And until that moment, she had lived without a single reason to doubt any of it. The moment of revelation, the moment when Michelle learned who she really was, is something that defies easy comprehension from the outside. Consider what it means to be told, at the age of 45, that your name is not your name. That your mother, the woman who raised you, who helped you with your homework, who was there when your own children were born, committed a crime to keep you. That there is a family in another state that has been grieving your absence for longer than you have been alive as a conscious being. That your entire sense of self, the very bedrock of your identity, rests on a foundation that was constructed by someone else's deception when you were 3 years old. For Deborah Lee Curry Newton, the resolution brought handcuffs and a charge. She was arrested for custodial interference, the formal legal acknowledgement that what she had done in April of 1983 was not a misunderstanding, not an act of desperate motherly protection, not a good-faith disagreement about where her child should live. It was a crime. She had willfully violated a court-ordered custody arrangement. She had physically removed a child from the care of her lawful guardians. She had concealed that child's true identity by giving her a false name. And she had maintained that concealment without interruption for 42 years, while a family in Kentucky searched and hoped and refused to give up. Deborah is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. That is a constitutional principle that applies to every person charged with every crime, regardless of the nature of the accusation or how long ago the alleged offense occurred. The legal system will now evaluate the documented facts of this case and render its judgment. The Charley Project updated Michelle's case page to a single word: resolved. After 42 years of databases, age progressions, tip lines, and family prayers, a missing persons case that had persisted across half a century was officially closed. The Charley Project's entry for Michelle Marie Newton concludes with a statement that is deceptively simple. Michelle has reunited with her searching relatives. That single sentence carries more emotional weight than any paragraph could adequately convey. For more than 4 decades, those relatives had lived with the absence of a child they loved. They had cooperated with every law enforcement request. They had kept Michelle's case alive through decades when the trail had gone cold and hope might reasonably have faded. They had endured the particular agony of ambiguous loss, the grief of not knowing whether someone you love is safe, the sorrow of imagining birthdays you cannot attend, the pain of looking at an age progression photo and wondering if the woman in the image would even recognize your name. And now, after 42 years, they have their answer. Michelle is alive, she is well, she is a mother of 3, and she knows, at last, who she really is and where she really came from. That reunion, as meaningful and miraculous as it is, arrives with a complexity that should not be minimized or romanticized. Michelle has no memories of her life before the age of 3. She has no conscious recollection of the family that searched for her. The relatives she is meeting are, in the most practical and human sense, strangers to her. Strangers connected by blood, bound by a shared history of loss, but without the day-to-day familiarity that makes family feel like family. Building those relationships will take time, patience, and a particular kind of courage that neither side ever expected to need. For Michelle's 3 children, the revelation adds another dimension of upheaval. The grandmother they have known their entire lives stands accused of a crime that reshaped their mother's entire existence before they were born. The family story they were raised with, the name they carry, the identity they inherited, all of it is now refracted through a truth that is as disorienting as it is undeniable. These are not easy revelations for any family to absorb, and the process of integrating them will unfold not over weeks or months, but over years. Cases like Michelle's carry a broader significance that extends beyond a single family's story. They challenge the assumptions that many people carry about what child abduction looks like. When most people hear the word abduction, they picture a stranger in a van, a playground, a moment of sudden violence. But the reality is that family abductions, committed by parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and other relatives, account for a significant and often underreported portion of child disappearances in the United States. These cases generate less media attention, attract fewer resources, and provoke less public urgency than stranger abductions precisely because the abductor is someone the child knows. The unspoken assumption is that the child must be safe because the child is with a parent. But safety and legality are not the same thing. And a child raised under a false name, severed from her family of origin, denied the most fundamental knowledge of her own identity, that child has been profoundly harmed, even if she was never physically injured. Michelle Marie Newton was 3 years old when she was taken from Louisville, Kentucky. She was approximately 45 when she was found in Florida. In the space between those two facts lies an entire human life. A childhood, an adolescence, a career, a marriage perhaps, 3 children, friendships, milestones, heartbreaks, triumphs, and an identity that was never truly hers. She did not choose any of it. She did not consent to any of it. The life she lived was the life her mother constructed for her, built on a foundation of concealment and sustained by decades of silence. Now, for the first time in her life, Michelle Marie Newton knows the truth. She knows her real name. She knows where she came from. She knows that there are people in Kentucky who loved her every single day of the 42 years she was gone. What she does with that knowledge, how she integrates it into the life she has already built, how she navigates the layered emotions of discovery, grief, reunion, and redefinition, is entirely her choice. It is a choice she has earned simply by enduring a situation she was never given the chance to consent to or refuse. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office can be reached at 502-83-63687. The Kentucky Crimes Against Children Unit can be reached at 502-57-42465. If you have any information about a missing child or a case of family abduction, please contact the appropriate authorities. Every call matters. Every piece of information has the potential to bring someone home. Every case deserves an answer. Every family deserves the truth. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing to Echo of Evidence. One click helps us continue telling the stories of those who deserve to be remembered.